My name is Beatrice Willis. I am 33 years old. My parents stole the $180,000 inheritance my grandmother left specifically for my medical education, used every penny of it to buy my older sister a 3-bedroom house in Sugar Land, and then looked me dead in the eye and told me I was being selfish for asking why I was the only one in the family who had to work night shifts as a nursing assistant just to afford rent. I was 18 years old. I had nothing but a used stethoscope and a dream they had already sold to the highest bidder. And for 15 years, I believed that I deserved exactly what they gave me, which was nothing. But last week, at their 40th anniversary party, I handed my mother a single piece of paper that made her collapse onto the hardwood floor of my townhouse. And for the first time in my life, the silence in that room finally belonged to me. Take a second to like and subscribe, because the phone call I got from my grandmother's estate attorney 7 years after she died is the reason I am standing in this kitchen today. I kept my mouth shut for 11 years because I told myself it was for the sake of the family. And I think most of us who grew up in houses where the truth was treated like a threat know exactly what it costs when you make that calculation. I spent over a decade holding my breath, waiting for a version of my parents that never actually existed to finally show up and tell me they were proud of me. While I worked 60-hour weeks at St. Jude's Medical Center to pay off the student loans they told me were my own responsibility. It all started in a hospital room at Memorial Hermann that smelled of antiseptic and those fading carnations you buy at a gas station when you're in a hurry. I was 17, sitting beside my grandmother, Rosemary, holding her hand like I had done every Sunday afternoon while my sister was out with her friends and my parents were busy with their country club committee meetings. My grandmother had been a seamstress for 40 years, and even then, with her strength fading, her fingers were rough and calloused, the hands of a woman who knew the value of every single stitch she ever placed in a fabric. She squeezed my hand, her voice barely through the oxygen mask, and told me that I was the only one who bothered to show up when the room was quiet. And she told me to remember what I was worth, even when everyone else seemed to forget. I didn't understand the weight of those words then, because I was still the girl who believed that if I just worked a little harder, if I made the dean's list, if I never asked for anything, I would eventually earn the same look of adoration my mother reserved for my sister. My sister was the golden child, a woman who moved through the world as if every floor had been polished just for her feet. And while I was sitting in that hospital room, she was planning a massive 21st birthday party at a boutique hotel downtown. I still remember my own 16th birthday a year before that, sitting at our formula kitchen table in Sugar Land with a supermarket cake and my father looking at his watch because he had a school board meeting he couldn't miss. That was the difference in our house. My sister got the fireworks, and I got the leftovers. And I just nodded and said thank you, because that's what a good daughter does in a family that values its reputation above its children. My grandmother saw it, though. Her eyes were sharp, even when the rest of her was failing, and she forced me to come closer, telling me she had prepared something for me and that I shouldn't let anyone take it away from me. I thought she was just confused from the medication, so I kissed her forehead and promised I'd be back the next day, not knowing that was the last time I would ever hear her voice. Rosemary died on a rainy Tuesday while I was in the middle of a chemistry lab, and my mother, Eleanor, didn't even call me. She sent a 3-word text telling me that my grandmother was gone and that I needed to come home and help pack up the house. There was no, "Are you okay?" No offer to pick me up from the metro stop, just instructions delivered with the same clinical efficiency she used to organize her library archives. I cried the entire bus ride home, feeling a hole opening up in my life that I knew no one in that house was going to help me fill. And when I walked through the front door, my sister was on the sofa scrolling through Facebook, while my mother was already arguing on the phone about the cost of a casket. No one hugged me, and no one asked if I wanted to talk about it, and the isolation felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest as I stood in the hallway, invisible as I had always been. At the funeral 4 days later at Westheimer Gardens, I stood alone by the graveside while my mother spent the entire service comforting my sister, who was weeping loudly because the heat was ruining her makeup. After the service, when we were back at the house, I overheard my father and my mother whispering in the study, a room I was rarely invited into, and my father's voice was low, mentioning a phone call from a lawyer and a complication with the will. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering, wondering what kind of secret could be so important on the day we buried the only person who truly loved me. But I didn't ask a single question. I was too afraid of causing more stress, too worried about making things worse, and too conditioned to believe that good daughters don't question their parents. So I went to my room and stared at the ceiling until 3 a.m. 2 weeks later, I was the only one who volunteered to clean out my grandmother's small apartment in the Heights because my sister said it was too depressing, and my mother claimed she was too overwhelmed with the estate paperwork. I was clearing out her bookshelf when a small envelope fell out of her worn copy of Little Women, the book she used to read to me when I was small enough to fit in the crook of her arm. Inside was a note in her shaky script, telling me she had left me everything she had worked for, and that I shouldn't trust anyone else with that knowledge, especially my own mother. I found my mother, Eleanor, in the living room of our house in Sugarland, and she didn't even look up from her tablet as I walked in with my hands trembling, clutching that small piece of paper like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly turned to liquid. I think most women who have raised a family know that specific silence that follows a question you aren't supposed to ask. The kind of stillness that feels like a wall being built brick by brick right in front of your face. I asked her, as calmly as I could, if my grandmother had left any kind of estate or savings, and she gave me that patient, dismissive smile she usually reserved for library patrons who couldn't find the fiction section, telling me that the woman who raised her had died with almost nothing but debt and a few old dresses. She looked me in the eye and said that my grandmother was confused and heavily medicated at the end, and that the note I was holding was just the rambling of a sick mind that didn't understand how money worked in the real world. I stood there feeling the weight of her lie, a cold, heavy thing that sat in the pit of my stomach, while she went back to her screen as if she hadn't just erased my grandmother's final wish with a single sentence. My father, Aidan, came home a few minutes later, and the two of them closed ranks around the dinner table with a precision that I now realize must have been practiced long before I ever walked through the door. I sat there in my usual chair, the one with the slightly wobbly leg that no one ever bothered to fix, while they talked about my sister's upcoming graduation and the big plans they had for her future. I kept thinking about my grandmother's hands, those rough, calloused fingers that had spent 40 years sewing bridal veils and prom dresses for every girl in the county, just so she could save enough to give me a fighting chance. She used to sit at her Singer sewing machine for hours, the rhythmic hum of the needle the only sound in her small kitchen, and she'd tell me that every stitch was a promise she was making to my future. She didn't buy new clothes or go on fancy vacations. She saved every $5 bill and every silver dollar because she saw how my parents looked at me compared to my sister, and she knew I was going to have to buy my own way out of that house. The silence of that dinner was broken by my sister, Sloane, who practically bounced into the room with her phone held out like a trophy, announcing to the table that she had found the perfect 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet subdivision. My heart stopped as my father nodded with a look of immense pride, telling her that they were going to help her with the $180,000 down payment because she deserved stability and a good start in life. I dropped my fork, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room, and I asked where that money had come from when they had just told me there was nothing left for my nursing school tuition. I sat there at that table, watching my mother slide a photo of a granite countertop kitchen toward my sister, while I knew my own future had just been auctioned off to pay for it. If you think you know what it feels like to be treated like a stranger in your own childhood home, tell me if you would have stayed quiet as long as I did. Like and subscribe. Because the way my father justified it with 5 simple words is something I still hear in the middle of a quiet night. My father set his glass down, his expression shifting from pride to a cold, hard stone. And he told me that they had been saving for years to make sure the family stayed together, and that my sister's happiness was an investment in all of us. I asked him how he could call it an investment when it was being stolen from the woman who had actually earned it, and his voice went lower, a dangerous edge creeping into his tone that I had only heard when he was dealing with disruptive students at the school district. He looked me dead in the eyes and told me to stop being selfish, saying that the money was free anyway, and that I was young enough to figure out my own path without expecting a handout. I kept thinking, I am 18 years old. I am working 40 hours a week as a certified nursing assistant while trying to finish my pre-med requirements. And the people who brought me into this world are calling me greedy for wanting the education their own mother died to give me. I think most of us who grew up in families where one child is the sun and the other is just a shadow know what it's like to realize you are entirely on your own, even when you're sitting 3 feet away from your parents. I looked at my mother, hoping for some flicker of guilt or a moment of maternal instinct. But she just and told me that I was tearing the family apart with my accusations, and that she couldn't believe her own daughter would be so petty. The guilt they pushed onto me was like a suffocating blanket, making me feel as though I was the one committing a crime by simply noticing that the numbers didn't add up. I realized then that they didn't just steal the money. They stole my right to be angry about it, turning my betrayal into a character flaw that they used to justify why I deserved less in the first place. I left the table without finishing my dinner, walking up the stairs to a room that suddenly felt like a prison cell. And I realized that my grandmother's warning hadn't been about a stranger or a distant relative. It was about the woman in the kitchen who was currently laughing with my sister. I had no money, no car that wasn't in my father's name, and no way to prove that the probate records were being manipulated by the very people who were supposed to be my legal guardians. I sat on the edge of my bed, and I promised myself that I would remember every word and every look, and that I would build a life so far away from their shadows that they would never be able to reach me again. I moved out of that house in Sugarland 3 weeks later, with nothing but 2 suitcases and a used stethoscope I'd bought with my own tips from the diner where I worked the graveyard shift. I didn't ask for help, and true to their word, my parents didn't offer any, watching from the front porch with a kind of detached curiosity, as if I were a stranger moving out of a rental property instead of their own daughter. I think most women who have raised a family know the quiet, hollow sound a house makes when the life you built inside it starts to fracture. But my mother, Eleanor, just stood there, holding a glass of iced tea, and told me to make sure I didn't leave any scuff marks on the hardwood floors. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a part of Houston where the streetlights hummed all night, and the laundromat was the only place that felt like home. And I started the long, exhausting process of building a life from the scraps my family had left behind. I enrolled at San Jacinto College, taking night classes while I worked as a certified nursing assistant at a convalescent home, spending my days cleaning rooms for people whose own children had forgotten them, which felt like a mirror I didn't want to look into. The most irrational thing happened about 6 months into my new life, a moment that proved to me that my parents weren't just indifferent. They were actively erasing any trace of the woman who had actually loved me. I had driven back to their house to pick up my grandmother's vintage Singer sewing machine, the one piece of her life I had asked to keep, because I wanted to feel the weight of her presence in my small apartment. I found my mother in the garage, and when I asked where the machine was, she shrugged and told me she'd sold it at a neighborhood garage sale for $50 because it was collecting dust and taking up space in the guest room. I stood there in that driveway, the Texas heat shimmering off the pavement, and I realized she had sold a 40-year legacy for the price of a designer diaper bag for my sister. That sewing machine had been the source of every Sunday dress I ever wore, the hum of its motor, the soundtrack to the only safety I'd ever known. And my mother had discarded it like a piece of thrift store furniture without a second thought. I think most women who have saved things over decades, the handmade quilts, the recipe cards, the things that carry a person's soul, know that feeling when you realize the people who should have guarded your history are the ones who threw it away. I spent those early years in a haze of caffeine and billable hours, taking every double shift the hospital would give me, while my sister, Sloane, was posting photos of the custom cabinetry and sub-zero appliances in the house my future had paid for. I would sit in my 10-year-old Honda Civic in the hospital parking lot, staring at those photos on my phone. And I'd tell myself that my grandmother was right. I was worth more than how they were treating me, even if I was the only one who believed it. I kept my mouth shut for years, not out of loyalty, but out of a desperate need to survive until I was strong enough to stand on my own 2 feet. I stayed quiet when they didn't invite me to Thanksgiving dinner because my sister's new in-laws were coming, and they didn't want to explain why I was working at a state-funded clinic instead of being successful like the rest of the family. I stayed quiet when my father called to ask if I could help out with my sister's medical bills after her boutique failed, as if the $180,000 they'd already taken wasn't enough of a contribution. Most of us who grew up in families where you are only valued for what you can give know that specific kind of exhaustion. The kind that settles into your bones when you realize that no matter how much you sacrifice, it will never be enough to earn the love they give so freely to someone else. I kept telling myself it was fine, that I was building my own life in Houston, a life made of clinical rotations and licensing exams. But every time I saw a mother and daughter in the cafeteria, or heard someone talk about their family's Sunday traditions, the wound would open all over again. I had become a senior cardiac nurse, a woman who could keep someone's heart beating in the middle of a code blue. But I still hadn't figured out how to fix the broken rhythm of my own family. I stayed in that silence for 11 years, holding that dead grandmother's note in my wallet like a talisman, waiting for the day when the truth would finally be louder than the lies they told at the dinner table. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon that started like every other day at the hospital, a letter arrived at my nursing station from a law firm I hadn't heard from since I was 17, and I realized that the silence was finally about to end. I took the elevator up to the 20th floor of a glass and steel building in downtown Houston, my nursing scrub still smelling faintly of the industrial hand sanitizer from my shift, and I stepped into an office that felt like it belonged to a different century. Douglas Sterling was a man in his late 60s with silver hair and the kind of steady gaze that comes from spending 40 years looking at the truth on notarized paper. And he sat me down in a burgundy leather chair that creaked with the weight of every secret ever told in that room. He apologized for the delay, his voice heavy with a regret that I wasn't prepared for, telling me he had been trying to locate me for years, but that every time he called my childhood home in Sugar Land, my father told him I was unstable and unable to handle my own affairs. I sat there in that quiet office, watching the afternoon sun reflect off the Minute Maid Park roof in the distance. And I realized that while I was working 70-hour weeks in the cardiac unit to save strangers, my own parents were telling the world I was broken, just so they could keep the money they'd stolen from my grandmother's life insurance and savings. He looked me in the eye in that office and handed me a certified document showing that my father had signed my name to a waiver while I was still 17, claiming I wanted my inheritance to go toward family stability instead of my own future. If you think you know what it feels like to watch someone forge your life away while you're still a child, tell me if this sounds like someone you know. Like and subscribe. Because what I found out next about the letter my grandmother had left for me in his safe deposit box is something I still can't speak about without my hands shaking. I think most women who have gotten a phone call or a letter that split their life into a before and an after know that feeling, where the room suddenly looks different and the air feels too thin to breathe. Douglas Sterling pushed a manila folder across the mahogany desk, and inside was the original will of my grandmother, Rosemary, along with the second letter she had written specifically for me. My father, the man who had spent 30 years as a school superintendent preaching about integrity and character to thousands of students, had looked this attorney in the face and lied, telling him I was unwell and had asked my parents to handle everything on my behalf. I kept thinking, I was 18 years old. I was sleeping on a thrift store mattress in a one-bedroom apartment, and the man who was supposed to be my protector was actively sabotaging my only chance at an education. The estate attorney told me that because I was a minor when the probate began, my parents acted as my legal guardians, and by the time I turned 18, the $180,000 had already been transferred into their joint checking account at Chase Bank. I felt a rage that didn't have a name, a hot, searing thing that sat right behind my ribs. But as a nurse, I had been trained to keep my face neutral even when everything was falling apart. I looked at the signature on the forfeiture form, a shaky, practiced imitation of my own handwriting, and I realized that my father hadn't just taken the money. He had taken my identity. He had used his position of authority, his knowledge of the legal system, and the trust the community placed in him to ensure that I would never be able to challenge them. Most of us who have watched a parent get older or seen the people around them start making decisions as if they are no longer in the room, know how quickly dignity can be stripped away. But I was experiencing it from the other side. My father had treated me like I was already gone, like I was just a ghost in my own life, whose only purpose was to provide a financial safety net for my sister's real estate ambitions. I took the letter from my grandmother and walked out of that building, driving until I found a small park near the heights where the oak trees were thick enough to hide me from the world. I sat in my car and read my grandmother's words, her elegant script filling 3 pages of stationery that smelled faintly of the peppermint she always kept in her purse. She told me she knew my mother, her own daughter, had always resented how much she loved me, and she warned me that my parents would try to redistribute what she had earned because they couldn't stand to see me have something they didn't control. She wrote that the money wasn't just a gift, it was my exit strategy from a family that only knew how to love the person who made them look good. I cried until my scrub top was soaked. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time in my life, I had proof that I wasn't the greedy or selfish daughter they had tried to make me believe I was. I think most women who have raised a family the way my grandmother did, quietly, steadily, without a single complaint, know what it means to reach the end of your life and realize the people you sacrificed for are the ones who are ready to pick your pockets before you're even in the ground. She had tried to protect me from beyond the grave, and my parents had intercepted that protection with the same casual cruelty they used to sell her Singer sewing machine. I sat there in the silence of my car, the Houston humidity heavy in the air, and I made a choice that would take me another 8 years to fully execute. I spent the next 8 years of my life turning my silence into a career and my grief into a home that actually felt like it belonged to me. I wasn't that 18-year-old girl with $60 in a Wells Fargo account and a heart full of unearned guilt anymore. I was a woman who could manage a cardiac intensive care unit with a steady hand while the world around me was falling apart. I bought a townhouse in a quiet corner of Houston, a place with a balcony where I could sit on Sunday mornings and have my coffee without wondering who was watching my every move or judging my worth by the car I drove. I think most women who have raised a family know that specific kind of peace that comes when you realize your kitchen finally belongs to you, and that the only sounds inside are the ones you choose to let in. I had built a life that didn't have a single footprint of my parents in it, and for a long time, I truly believed that was going to be enough to heal the wound they had left behind. It was during those years that I met General Thorne, a woman I met in a graduate program for healthcare administration who happened to be a forensic auditor for one of the Big Four firms. When I finally told her the story of the missing inheritance and the woman who had spent 40 years at a sewing machine just to have it all stolen by her own children, she got a look in her eyes that was colder than any surgical suite I'd ever worked in. She spent months tracing the paper trail through probate court records and public tax filings, finding the exact moment my father moved the money from my grandmother's trust into a down payment for my sister's house. She found the gift letters with my forged signature and the bank transfers that proved my mother had been lying every time she told me the family was struggling to keep the lights on. I kept all of those documents in a manila envelope in the back of my closet, a weight I carried with me every day, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally be worth more than the silence I'd kept for so long. While I was building my world, theirs was slowly beginning to fray at the edges. A slow unraveling that no one in Sugarland wanted to admit was happening to a man of my father's standing. My sister Sloane saw her marriage fall apart after 5 years of living in a house she hadn't earned, and she ended up selling that 3-bedroom ranch at a massive loss because she had never learned how to manage a mortgage or a budget. My father made a series of bad investments in commercial real estate that wiped out most of his superintendent pension, and my mother's health began to fail in ways that their standard insurance didn't fully cover. They burned through their savings and their credit, eventually selling the family home and moving into a small rental apartment that was a fraction of the size of the house where they had once sat in judgment of me. I watched it all from a distance, never interfering and never offering a hand, because I knew that the only way for them to understand the weight of what they'd done was to finally feel the weight of their own choices. Most of us who grew up in families where you were the easy child know the feeling of a phone call that starts with a sweetness that feels entirely unearned. 6 months ago, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening while I was folding laundry, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw my mother's name on the screen. Her voice was melodic, that practiced tone she used whenever she was about to ask for something, telling me that she and my father were celebrating their 40th anniversary and they wanted to have a party. She mentioned that their new place was too small for the 30 guests they had already invited, and that my townhouse looked so spacious in the photos they'd seen on Instagram. I sat on the edge of my bed, and I felt the old familiar feeling of being used. A sensation that usually made me feel invisible, but this time, I didn't shrink. I stood up and looked at the manila envelope in my closet, and I realized that after 15 years of being the one who stayed quiet, I was finally ready to be the one who spoke. I spent the next week preparing my house for a celebration that was never meant to be a party, but a foreclosure on the lies that had held my family together for 15 years. I ordered catering from a bistro in the Heights, cleaned every inch of the granite countertops, and placed that manila envelope in the hallway closet, where it sat like a ticking clock, waiting for the strike of noon. My parents arrived 2 hours early on that Saturday afternoon, pulling their budget rental car into my driveway and staring up at the brick and stucco exterior of my townhouse with a mixture of envy and entitlement that I could feel through the window glass. I watched my father, Aiden, step out first, his eyes immediately scanning the neighborhood to judge the property values, while my mother smoothed her dress with a practiced grace, as if she were the queen of a castle she hadn't spent a single dime to build. My sister, Sloane, trailed behind them, looking at my home with a hollow kind of hunger that told me she was already mentally arranging her own furniture in my guest rooms. When I opened the door, they walked into my foyer as if they were performing an inspection for a real estate appraisal, my father asking how much I paid for the hardwood floors before he even bothered to say hello. I think most women who have built a life from nothing know that specific sting when someone tries to claim credit for your success, after they were the ones who tried to ensure you never had any. My mother touched the custom draperies and told me how lucky I was to have such a beautiful space, never once mentioning the double shifts or the nursing school debt I had to carry because she'd handed my inheritance to my sister. They moved through my kitchen, opening cabinets and testing the stainless steel appliances, while I stood there in the silence, realizing that, to them, I wasn't a daughter who had survived. I was just a retirement plan they had forgotten to finalize. I stood there in my own kitchen, listening to my father calculate the market value of every square foot I had earned with my own sweat, while he still treated me like the 18-year-old girl he'd pushed into the shadows. If you've ever had to make a choice like that, tell me if you think she made the right call. Like and subscribe. Because the look on my mother's face when she realized I wasn't going to play my part is something I will never forget. By 2 o'clock, the house was filled with 32 people, a sea of faces from a childhood I had tried to outrun. Uncles who had ignored my graduation, cousins who only called when they needed medical advice, and family friends who still whispered about how well my sister was doing despite her boutique failing. I circulated through the room with a tray of appetizers, playing the part of the gracious hostess, while my mother held court on my sectional sofa as if she were the one who had signed the mortgage. I saw my Aunt Martha standing by the window, the only person besides my grandmother who had ever sent me a birthday card that didn't have a Sugarland postmark, and she caught my eye with a look of quiet concern. She knew the rhythm of our family better than anyone, and she could see the storm clouds gathering behind my eyes, even as I smiled and poured another glass of Chardonnay for a cousin I hadn't seen in a decade. The atmosphere in the room was thick with the kind of rehearsed nostalgia that usually precedes a request for money, and I could see my father clearing his throat as he prepared to deliver his anniversary toast. He clinked his glass with a silver spoon, the sharp sound cutting through the chatter of my relatives, and he began to speak about 40 years of sacrifice and family loyalty. He stood there in the center of my living room, under a chandelier I had paid for with my overtime pay, and he told the room that they were facing some temporary transitions, and that they were so grateful to have a daughter who understood that blood was thicker than water. I saw my mother's eyes glistening with those perfectly timed tears she used whenever she wanted to make a refusal feel like an act of cruelty. And I realized they were about to perform their final act of theft right in front of everyone I knew. I think most of us who grew up in families where the truth is treated like a burden know that moment when you realize the person speaking isn't talking to you. They're talking to the audience they've spent years building. My father turned toward me, his voice trembling with a calculated vulnerability, and he asked the room to witness the blessing of a family that takes care of its own. He was setting the stage, building a wall of public expectation that he thought was too high for me to climb over, assuming that my old fear of conflict would keep me pinned to the floor. But he didn't realize that the woman standing in front of him wasn't the girl from the Sugarland kitchen. I was a senior cardiac nurse who had seen the end of life too many times to be afraid of a few uncomfortable sentences. The manila envelope was still in the closet, and as my father took a breath to ask for the keys to my house, I felt a strange, cold peace settle over me, because I knew that for the first time in 15 years, the ending of this story was finally mine to write. I walked to the hallway closet while my father was still mid-sentence, his voice trailing off into a confused silence as I returned to the center of the living room with that heavy manila envelope in my hand. The room went so quiet that I could hear the hum of the central air conditioning and the distant sound of a lawnmower from 3 houses down. 32 pairs of eyes tracking my every move as I stepped toward the man who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was the one who didn't understand the meaning of family. I didn't say a word as I handed the envelope to my father, Aiden, whose hand shook just slightly as he took it, his face pale and tight as he pulled out the first document, a certified bank statement from Chase that showed exactly where my grandmother's $180,000 had gone. I think most women who have spent their lives being the one to keep the family secrets know that specific, terrifying lightness that comes when you finally let the truth fall out into the open for everyone to see. I stood there, a senior cardiac nurse who had spent years delivering hard news to families in waiting rooms. And I told him, loud enough for every aunt, uncle, and cousin in that room to hear, that he was right about family taking care of each other, and that it was time everyone finally knew how he and my mother had taken care of my grandmother's final wishes. The sound of my mother, Eleanor, was the only thing that broke the silence as the papers began to circulate among the guests, the notarized will and the transfer records passing from hand to hand like a slow-moving fire through a dry field. I watched my Aunt Martha take the second page, her eyes widening behind her reading glasses as she read the forensic audit that General Thorne had helped me compile, a document that proved my father had forged a gift letter while my grandmother was semi-conscious in the ICU at Memorial Hermann. He had taken the hand of a dying woman, the same hand that had sewn every Sunday dress I ever owned, and he had used it to sign away my future while she was too weak to even recognize his face. I kept thinking about my grandmother's hands in those final hours, how they were so still and thin, and the thought that my father had used them as a tool for his own greed made my skin crawl with a coldness that no Houston summer could ever warm. Anyone who has watched a parent get older knows how quickly the people around them start treating them like they are no longer the person they used to be. But seeing it documented in black and white, with a notary seal and a time-stamped signature, turned the air in my living room into something thick and sour that no one wanted to breathe. My mother tried to grab the papers, her voice shrill and desperate as she told the room that I was confused and that I was fabricating evidence to ruin their 40th anniversary. But the bank stamps and the legal seals were louder than any lies she could tell at that granite island. I stood there, and I named the cost of their choices, turning to face my sister Sloane and telling her that the 3-bedroom ranch she had lived in for 10 years was built on the theft of my education and the betrayal of the woman who had loved me most. I told the room about the 3 jobs I worked, the student loans I was still paying off at St. Jude's, and the way my parents had called me selfish for 15 years, just to keep me from asking the questions they couldn't answer. The guests began to shift and mutter, a collective realization washing over the room as the image of the perfect Sugarland family dissolved into the reality of financial elder abuse and probate fraud. My father looked at me with a mixture of rage and fear, his jaw working but no sound coming out, while my mother finally collapsed onto her knees on my hardwood floor, her rehearsed tears finally turning into the genuine sobbing of a woman who realized she had no more shadows left to hide in. I reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out the permanent restraining order I had filed with the Harris County District Court, a document that stated they were to have no contact with me or my property from that moment forward. I told them that family doesn't steal from each other, and that the blood they kept talking about didn't give them a permanent license to treat me like a financial resource instead of a daughter. I think most women who have had to set a hard boundary with someone they love know that it doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like a funeral for the person you wished they were, and a final closing of a door that you spent your whole life trying to keep open. I watched my Aunt Martha stand up and walk toward me, her hand on my shoulder as she looked at my parents with a disgust that was older than I was. And I realized that the house I had built was finally strong enough to keep the people who wanted to tear it down on the outside. The party didn't end with a toast or a cake. It ended with 30 people walking out of my front door in a silence that was so heavy it felt like a physical weight, leaving my parents and my sister standing in a room full of abandoned appetizers and the wreckage of a 15-year lie. I looked at the three of them, the people who had made me feel invisible for half my life. And I realized that for the first time since I was 17, I could finally see myself clearly. The morning after the party, the silence in my townhouse felt different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret kept too long, but the clean, open quiet of a house that had finally been aired out. My phone stayed busy for 3 days with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from since I was a teenager. People like my Aunt Martha, who called to tell me they were cutting contact with my parents because what they did was something that couldn't be smoothed over with a polite apology at a Sunday brunch. I think most women who have raised a family in a community like Sugarland know how quickly a reputation can dissolve when the truth finally comes out. And my father, Aiden, found that his 30 years as a school superintendent didn't mean anything once the neighborhood knew he had forged his own mother's signature to steal from his daughter. He and my mother, Eleanor, were forced to move into a one-bedroom subsidized senior apartment in a part of Harris County they used to drive around, living on a Social Security check that barely covers the basics because they had burned through every cent of their pension trying to maintain a life they hadn't earned. My sister had to take a job as a customer service lead at a Target to pay her own rent for the first time in her 35 years. And for once, there was no one left to write a check to save her from the consequences of her own choices. I took $20,000 of the money I had managed to save from my years as a senior cardiac nurse, and I established the Rosemary Willis Nursing Scholarship at the University of Houston, a fund specifically for first-generation students who are trying to build a future while working the graveyard shift. I wanted her name, the name of a woman who spent 40 years at a sewing machine, to stand for something more than the betrayal of her children. And every time I see a new recipient's name on that list, I feel like I am finally giving my grandmother the legacy she was supposed to have. I think most of us who have watched a parent be dismissed as they get older know that the greatest gift you can give them is to make sure their story is told the right way. And I finally made sure that my grandmother was remembered as the one who tried to protect me, not the woman who died with nothing. I don't need my parents to acknowledge what they did, and I don't need my sister to understand why the house she lived in was never hers to keep, because I have realized that the only validation that matters is the kind you give to yourself when you finally decide you are worth the trouble of the truth. My parents, Eleanor and Aiden, lost their standing in the community, their country club membership, and the respect of every relative who had sat at their table for 40 years, eventually becoming the very thing they feared most: ordinary people living in a small room with nothing but their own excuses to keep them company. My sister lost her financial safety net and was forced to learn that a home is something you build with your own hands, not something you take from a 17-year-old who is too afraid to fight back. I, on the other hand, regained the parts of myself that I thought were gone forever. The girl who loved to learn, the woman who knew how to lead, and the granddaughter who finally kept her promise. They spent 15 years pretending I was the problem, telling the world I was unstable and greedy just to cover their own tracks. But now, the only thing left of their lie is the empty space where they used to stand in my life. The comparison is simple. They traded their integrity for a 3-bedroom ranch and a few years of looking successful to the neighbors, while I traded my silence for a life that is actually mine. I realized that for over a decade, I wasn't waiting for them to love me. I was just waiting for my own permission to leave the table where I was never truly welcome. My worth was never something they had the power to decide, even if they used a notarized document and a forged signature to try and prove otherwise. I have my coffee on my back porch every morning now, looking out at the yard I paid for with my own hospital shifts, and the only sounds I hear are the birds and the wind in the Texas oaks. And I am no longer afraid of what the phone might say. Every Sunday, I host a small dinner at my own table, and my Aunt Martha sits in the good chair, and we talk about the future instead of the past, because the family I have built is finally the one I deserve. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and like and subscribe, because there is always someone out there watching the people they love be treated like they no longer matter, and they need to know it is not too late to stand up for them.